The boat sliced through the dark waters of the river, pushing through thick mist as the American photographer, Daniel, adjusted the camera strap slung over his shoulder. His fingers twitched, itching to snap pictures of the dense Amazonian jungle rising around him. But there would be time for that later. For now, the tribe waited. First time out here? One of the UN volunteers asked from beside him, the roar of the boat's motor forcing him to shout. Daniel nodded, eyes scanning the tangled vines and towering trees that swallowed the horizon. Yeah, first time. Heard they've come a long way since they were first contacted. Solar panels, radios, English lessons. The whole works. They're still pretty isolated, the volunteer replied. But it's incredible how fast they've adapted. The village leader is quite the character too, you'll see. As they approached the village, the murmur of conversation faded. Smoke curled into the air from small huts that lined the muddy shore. Children played near the water's edge, their laughter carrying across the river as the boat pulled in. Daniel immediately raised his camera, capturing the moment. Simple, untouched by modern life. Or so it seemed. Once they docked, the villagers greeted the group with nods and small smiles. Daniel felt the shift in atmosphere as the tribe leader approached. A tall, imposing figure draped in colorful woven cloth, his face lined with age and wisdom. He extended his hand to Daniel, who quickly shook it. "Welcome to our home," the leader said in broken English. His voice was deep and firm, but there was warmth beneath it. "We are glad you have come to see our progress." "Thank you," Daniel replied, impressed. "I've heard a lot about how your village has embraced modern technology. I'd love to talk more about that. Maybe take some photos too." The leader chuckled softly. "Yes, we have learned much. Come, I will show you." As they walked through the village, Daniel marveled at the contrast. Solar panels attached to the tops of thatched huts, radios crackling with voices from far-off places, and even a small classroom where children were learning basic English phrases. It was the perfect mix of tradition and progress, and Daniel's camera clicked away, capturing each scene. They reached the center of the village, where the tribe leader sat down by a crackling fire, tuning a small radio. Daniel joined him, intrigued by how relaxed the man seemed, given the remoteness of their location. "This radio," the leader said, smiling proudly, "it tells us what is happening in the world. It brings news to our village." Daniel nodded, snapping a picture of the leader holding the radio. "Amazing how far your village has come." The leader listened intently to the static-filled voice on the radio. Daniel couldn't understand the language, but the leader's face lit up. "They say there will be an eclipse. A total solar eclipse in 2 days." Daniel perked up, intrigued. "Really? That's rare. Have you ever seen one before?" The leader shook his head, still focused on the crackling voice. "No, but it is coming." Daniel leaned back, adjusting his camera settings. "Well, it's nothing to worry about. It's just the moon passing in front of the sun. The sky will go dark for a few minutes, and then it'll be over. I could show you on my phone." But before Daniel could finish, the leader's smile faded. He turned to one of his men, shouting orders in his native language. Within moments, the village erupted into motion. Villagers began running toward the perimeter, gathering wood, sharpening spears, and digging pits near the edges of the settlement. The sound of hammers clanged as they hastily built spike-filled barricades. Daniel frowned, lowering his camera. "What's going on?" One of the volunteers stepped up beside him, equally confused. "I don't know. They're acting like there's a storm coming." The tribe leader returned to Daniel, his face now grave. "We must prepare. The monsters will come." "Monsters?" Daniel chuckled nervously, thinking it was some kind of local legend. "It's just an eclipse. Nothing bad will happen. It'll get dark for a few minutes, but the sun will come back." The leader's eyes bore into his. "The eclipse here is different. In the darkness, the monsters come. Always." Daniel exchanged a glance with the volunteers. One of them, an older woman, shook her head and whispered, "Local folklore, probably. Nothing to worry about." But Daniel couldn't shake the unease building in his chest. The leader's sudden shift from relaxed to deadly serious rattled him. Yet, he still couldn't bring himself to believe it. "You don't really think there are monsters, do you?" Daniel asked, still clinging to his rationality. The leader didn't respond. He simply turned and joined the villagers in their frantic preparations. Daniel looked back at the volunteers, unsure of what to say. "It's just superstition, right?" No one answered. The village had transformed in a matter of hours. Where there had once been a calm, welcoming atmosphere, now there was urgency. Villagers hammered wooden stakes into the ground, digging pits and setting up makeshift barricades at the edge of the jungle. The air was filled with the harsh clatter of tools and the murmur of hurried conversations. One of the volunteers, a younger man named Jason, stood beside him, scratching his head. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "They're building traps like they're preparing for a battle." Daniel nodded, lowering his camera. "Yeah, I know. The eclipse is just a natural event. It's science." "What do they think is going to happen?" Jason shrugged. "They're scared of something. Whether it's monsters or not, we should probably be careful. Panicked people can be unpredictable." A loud thud interrupted their conversation. Daniel turned to see a group of villagers dragging sharpened logs toward the village's entrance, creating a spiked barricade. The tribe leader was at the center of the action, barking orders with a firm, resolute tone. Daniel made his way over, stepping carefully around piles of wood and hastily dug pits. "Hey," he called out to the leader, "you really don't need to do this. The eclipse won't last more than a few minutes. It's just a shadow." The leader turned to him, sweat glistening on his brow. "You don't understand." His voice was low, steady. "The monsters always come during the eclipse. It has happened before. It will happen again." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but the leader's gaze was unshakable. There was no trace of humor, no sign of doubt. Whatever these monsters were, the leader believed in them completely. "It's an old legend, right?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though a sliver of doubt wormed its way into his chest. "Folklore. Stories to scare children." The leader stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "This is not a story. The darkness of the eclipse brings them out. We have seen it. Our ancestors saw it. We have prepared every time, but it is never enough." Daniel clenched his camera tighter. He wanted to push back, to tell the leader that this was just fear talking, that the eclipse was nothing but a natural phenomenon. But something about the leader's certainty gave him pause. "I've been to a lot of places," Daniel said, trying one last time. "I've seen plenty of strange beliefs, but none of it ever turns out to be true. You don't have to worry. I promise. Nothing will come out of the jungle." The leader stared at him for a long moment, then turned away, his face set in grim determination. "You will see." Frustration bubbled up in Daniel's chest. He turned to Jason, who had been listening quietly. "What do you think?" Daniel asked. "Should we try to convince them to stop? This just feels like mass hysteria." Jason shook his head. "I don't think we should interfere. They seem pretty set on this. If it helps them feel safe, maybe we should let them." Daniel sighed, still struggling to make sense of the situation. He watched as the villagers finished securing the barricades and traps, the mood in the village growing more tense by the minute. Women sharpened spears while children were hurried into the safety of their homes. No one spoke of the eclipse as a wondrous event. They only prepared for it like soldiers going to war. "Fine," Daniel said, still not convinced. "But when the eclipse passes and nothing happens, I hope they don't tear the village apart out of shame." Jason glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "And if something does happen?" Daniel scoffed, but a nervous laugh escaped him. "If monsters really do come out of the jungle, I'll eat my camera." The two fell silent as the village leader approached, his face cast in shadow by the fading light. He paused before them, his expression unreadable. "We have done all we can. You must stay inside the village during the eclipse. Do not wander beyond the barriers." Daniel wanted to protest, but something in the leader's voice stopped him. Instead, he nodded. "We'll stay inside." Without another word, the leader turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in the middle of the bustling village, his camera heavy around his neck. The preparations continued long into the night, the village lit by dim fires as they fortified every possible entrance. The thick, oppressive humidity seemed to press down on everything, but no one rested. Even the volunteers were growing uneasy, casting glances toward the jungle, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. Jason walked up to Daniel, who was reviewing his photos by the firelight. "This is crazy, right? I mean, we're sitting in a village waiting for a bunch of monsters to show up during an eclipse. It sounds like a bad horror movie." Daniel nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he flicked through the images on his camera. "Yeah, it's absurd. Monsters don't exist." But deep down, Daniel wasn't sure anymore. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. The once peaceful village was now a fortress with spiked barricades, pitfall traps, and sharpened spears stacked in every corner. The air buzzed with nervous energy, and the tension was palpable. Every villager was on edge, working from dawn until late into the night. Even the children seemed to sense the impending doom, staying close to their mothers and fathers, who occasionally cast worried glances toward the jungle. Daniel continued snapping photos, documenting the transformation, but the unease gnawed at him. As much as he tried to focus on his work, there was something about the tribe's fear that got under his skin. He couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something out there. But every time the thought surfaced, he pushed it away. "It's just folklore," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his camera settings. Nothing more. The UN volunteers kept busy too, though their conversations had grown quieter. They were less sure now, especially after witnessing how seriously the tribe took their preparations. Some of them had even pitched in, helping fortify the village despite their shared skepticism. Daniel, however, refused to participate. He stuck to his role as the detached observer, capturing moments with his lens, but keeping his distance from the panic. On the morning of the eclipse, the village was silent. The usual chatter and laughter had vanished, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. The tribe leader stood in the center of the village, eyes scanning the sky as if watching for a sign. Daniel approached him cautiously, the camera heavy around his neck. "Today's the day," Daniel said, forcing a smile. "The eclipse should happen around noon. Are you ready?" The leader's gaze remained fixed on the treetops. "We are prepared," he replied, his voice calm but laced with tension. "But no one is ever truly ready." Daniel shifted awkwardly, trying to break the tension. "Look, I've been thinking. I know you believe in these monsters, but there's really no reason to worry. I mean, we've been through eclipses before in other places, and nothing like this has ever happened." The leader turned to him, his expression unreadable. "The monsters do not come in other places. They come here." Daniel sighed. He had heard the same thing from the leader several times now, and it still didn't make sense to him. "What exactly are these monsters?" he asked. "Have you seen them? What do they look like?" The leader's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Daniel saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps. "They are shadows. They move in the dark. You cannot see them clearly, but you feel them. You hear them. They are hungry." Daniel's stomach tightened, but he shook his head, trying to maintain his rational stance. "It sounds like a story. A scary one, but still just a story." The leader gave him a long, steady look. "You will see soon enough." By midday, the sky began to change. The light dimmed, casting long, eerie shadows across the village. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. The villagers gathered near the center of the village, clutching their spears and huddling close to one another. Even the children remained quiet, their wide eyes fixed on the sky. Daniel positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, his camera ready. He had never seen an eclipse in such an isolated setting, and despite the strange tension in the air, a part of him was excited to capture the moment. As the moon began its slow crawl across the sun, the jungle around them darkened, and an unsettling quiet fell over the village. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine. He glanced around at the volunteers, who stood a few feet away, huddled together and whispering nervously. The villagers, however, were deadly silent, their eyes trained on the sky and the edge of the jungle beyond the barricades. The light grew dimmer, almost like dusk, but more unnatural. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the ground in strange, warped shapes. Daniel swallowed hard and raised his camera, capturing the eerie transition. His finger hovered over the shutter, but something in the pit of his stomach told him to stop. He lowered the camera slowly, his heart beginning to pound. Then, everything went dark. For a moment, the world stood still. The sun was gone, completely swallowed by the moon, and the village was plunged into a suffocating blackness. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The darkness felt alive, thick, almost tangible. His heart raced as the silence pressed in from all sides. Then a sound. It started as a faint rustling in the trees. Daniel's head snapped toward the jungle, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. His pulse quickened. He could hear something moving, something big, but invisible, like shadows sliding through the trees. The sound grew louder, closer. The villagers gripped their spears tighter, eyes wide with terror. The leader stood at the front, unmoving, his jaw clenched. Daniel's camera hung uselessly at his side. His mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but the noise, the horrible skittering noise, was impossible to ignore. And then, a scream. One of the volunteers, a young woman, cried out as a shape emerged from the edge of the jungle. Daniel's heart froze. It was there, just barely visible, a twisted, distorted shadow that moved unnaturally, its shape flickering in and out of focus. Another scream followed as more of the shadows appeared, creeping closer, fast and silent. Daniel stumbled back, his camera slipping from his grip as his rational world crumbled before his eyes. The monsters were real. The monsters were here. The darkness was absolute. Daniel had experienced night in the jungle before, but this was different. Thicker, unnatural, as if the world had been swallowed by an unseen force. His breath came in shallow gasps as he fumbled for his camera, but it was useless now. No lens could capture what his mind struggled to comprehend. Around him, the villagers clutched their spears, faces pale with terror. The UN volunteers stood frozen, wide-eyed, their previous skepticism replaced by palpable fear. No one dared to move. And then came the sound again, louder this time. A skittering, scraping noise, as if something massive was moving just out of sight, slithering through the trees. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. His rational mind screamed for an explanation, but there was none. The tribe leader had been right all along. "They're coming." The leader's voice was low, filled with dread. The first attack was swift. One of the villagers near the edge of the barricade screamed, then fell silent. Daniel barely had time to turn before he saw the flicker of movement. A dark shape, barely visible, dragging the villager's body into the shadows. Blood splattered across the ground. "Defend the village." The leader shouted, raising his spear high. The other villagers followed suit, rushing toward the barricades to fend off the unseen attackers. But it was chaos. Spears thrust into the darkness, but nothing seemed to hit the mark. The creatures moved too quickly, slipping in and out of sight like living shadows. Daniel stumbled backward, fear paralyzing his limbs. His camera dangled uselessly around his neck as he watched the horror unfold. This couldn't be real. Monsters didn't exist. He had told himself that over and over again, but now, as the creatures struck again, his disbelief shattered. He could barely make out their forms. Distorted, flickering shapes that seemed to merge with the darkness itself, their movements impossibly fast. Screams echoed through the village. Villagers and volunteers alike fell, their bodies snatched away by the creatures before anyone could react. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears as he saw the UN volunteer, Jason, desperately trying to defend himself with a sharpened stick. Jason barely managed a single thrust before one of the creatures lunged at him, pulling him into the blackness. Daniel was frozen. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. He stumbled backward until he hit the central hut, pressing himself against the wooden wall. The chaotic scene unfolded before his eyes. People he had spoken with just hours ago were being slaughtered by things he couldn't even properly see. Suddenly, the tribe leader cried out. One of the monsters had closed in on him, its shadowy form twisting as it moved with inhuman speed. The leader's spear struck out, but it passed through the creature as if hitting smoke. The monster lashed out, and the leader staggered, blood pouring from a gash in his side. Without thinking, Daniel rushed forward, adrenaline surging through his veins. His disbelief was gone, replaced by raw instinct. He grabbed a fallen spear and hurled it toward the shadow looming over the leader. The spear sliced through the air and struck something. A brief flash of resistance before the shadow recoiled, slithering back into the jungle. Daniel reached the leader, pulling him to his feet. "Come on," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the screams and chaos. The leader groaned in pain, clutching his side, but Daniel dragged him toward one of the fortified huts at the edge of the village. They stumbled inside, the wooden door slamming shut behind them. The leader collapsed against the wall, his face pale and streaked with sweat. Blood soaked through his robe, but he was alive. "You saved me," the leader muttered, his voice weak. Daniel was shaking, adrenaline still coursing through him. He pressed his back against the door, eyes wide as the sounds of battle raged outside. What the hell are those things? The leader's eyes fluttered shut for a moment. "They are the shadows. They come for us during the eclipse, always." Daniel's breath was ragged. He had seen enough. This wasn't folklore. It wasn't some story passed down through generations. The monsters were real, and they were killing everyone. The door rattled violently, and Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. One of the creatures slammed against the barricade outside, its distorted shape flickering in the dim light. Daniel grabbed a spear from the wall, holding it with trembling hands, ready to defend the leader and himself if the door gave way. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the assault slowed. The sounds of battle faded, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Daniel strained to hear, his knuckles white around the spear. His ears were filled with the sound of his own shallow breathing. Outside, the darkness still loomed, but the creatures seemed to have retreated for the moment. He glanced down at the leader, who had slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow but steady. "They will return," the leader whispered. "They always return before the light comes back." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had saved the leader, but what now? They were trapped, surrounded by creatures that defied explanation. His skepticism had vanished, replaced by a primal need to survive. His camera, once his prized possession, now felt like a useless weight around his neck. The monsters wouldn't care about pictures or evidence. All that mattered now was making it to daylight. The village was silent, save for the occasional crackle of distant fires. Daniel's grip on the spear tightened, his breath shallow as he crouched near the entrance of the fortified hut. The tribe leader, wounded and exhausted, lay against the far wall, his eyes closed in pain. Outside, the darkness persisted, thick and impenetrable, but Daniel knew it wasn't over. "They'll be back," the leader had said. His words echoed in Daniel's mind. "They always come before the light returns." Daniel tried to steady his nerves, his thoughts a chaotic blur. His disbelief had been obliterated, replaced by raw survival instinct. The monsters, the shadows, were real, and they were hunting. But even as he struggled to process what he had seen, one thought kept clawing its way to the surface. He had to stay alive. He glanced down at the tribe leader, who was slipping in and out of consciousness. The blood soaking through his robe was alarming, but Daniel wasn't sure how to help him. His hands trembled as he looked around the small hut for anything that might stop the bleeding. Grabbing a length of cloth from a nearby shelf, he pressed it against the leader's side, hoping it would slow the blood loss. "Hold on," Daniel whispered, his voice strained. "Just a little longer." The leader groaned softly, barely able to respond. Outside, the jungle was deathly still. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he strained to listen for any sign of movement, any hint that the creatures had returned. But for now, all he could hear was the eerie silence. Minutes dragged on like hours. Daniel's legs ached from crouching, but he didn't dare move. His mind raced, replaying the chaotic attack, the flickering shadows, the blood, the screams. It all felt like a nightmare. And yet, here he was, trapped in the heart of it. Suddenly, a faint rustle broke the silence. Daniel's heart leaped into his throat. He froze, every muscle tensed as he listened. The noise came again, closer this time, like something brushing against the barricades outside. His knuckles whitened around the spear, his pulse racing. The leader stirred, his voice weak. "They're coming." Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. He edged toward the door, spear raised, eyes locked on the cracks between the wooden planks. The hut was dark, but a dim glow from the dying fires outside cast eerie shadows on the walls. Another sound, this time a soft, scraping noise, like claws dragging across wood. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as the realization hit him. The creatures hadn't left. They were waiting, circling the village, and now they were closing in again. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, and Daniel stumbled back, nearly dropping the spear. Something outside slammed into the barricade, the wooden door groaning under the pressure. His breathing hitched as he braced himself, spear ready to strike. But the door held, for now. "They're trying to get in," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. The leader's eyes fluttered open, though he was too weak to rise. "They will come again," he rasped. "They always return for the rest." Daniel's mind raced, trying to think of what to do. He could hear more movement outside now, soft shuffling noises as the creatures circled the hut. They moved like shadows. Quick, silent, and impossible to track. There was no way to know when or where they would strike. Daniel pressed his back against the door, his heart thundering in his chest. He couldn't stay here. They had to move, but where? The village was in ruins, and the jungle was teeming with the creatures. He didn't know how many of the villagers or volunteers were left, but he doubted there were many survivors. The leader groaned again, his breathing labored. Daniel glanced at him, fear gripping him tightly. "We can't stay here," Daniel whispered. "We'll be trapped if they break through." The leader's eyes opened slightly, and he gave a weak nod. "The fire," he murmured. Daniel frowned, unsure what the leader meant. "What about the fire?" The leader's voice was barely a whisper. "They fear the light. The fire, it keeps them away." Daniel's pulse quickened. It made sense. The creatures had only attacked once the eclipse had plunged the world into darkness. If they could reach one of the fires, Maybe it would hold the monsters back long enough to survive until the light returned. But it was a gamble. The fires outside had nearly burned out, and getting there would mean crossing open ground, exposed to the creatures. Daniel glanced at the barricaded door, which groaned again under the weight of another attack. They didn't have a choice. "Okay," Daniel said, voice shaking. "We'll make a run for it. We'll get to the fire, and then we'll figure something out." He carefully helped the leader to his feet, the man groaning in pain as he tried to stand. The leader leaned heavily on Daniel, who struggled to support his weight. His body screamed with exhaustion, but he pushed the pain aside. They had to move. Gripping the spear tightly, Daniel took a deep breath and flung the door open. They stumbled out into the village, the cold darkness immediately enveloping them. The dim glow from the smoldering fire pit was barely visible, but it was their only hope. Daniel's heart raced as he scanned the surrounding shadows, the eerie silence pressing in around them. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Daniel saw one of the creatures, its shape shifting in and out of focus as it slithered between the trees, circling them. "Oh!" Daniel shouted, half dragging the leader toward the fire pit. His muscles screamed in protest, but adrenaline drove him forward. The creatures moved swiftly now, their distorted forms closing in from all directions. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears as they neared the fire, the heat of the flames barely warming his skin. Just as they reached the edge of the fire pit, one of the creatures lunged at them, a twisted blur of shadow. Daniel swung the spear wildly, his movements driven more by fear than skill, and the spear struck the creature just enough to send it skittering back into the darkness. They collapsed by the fire, the heat flickering around them like a protective barrier. Daniel's chest heaved with exhaustion as he glanced at the leader, who was barely conscious. The creatures circled just beyond the firelight, their distorted shapes flickering in and out of view. They wouldn't come closer. Not yet. They had survived. For now. Daniel stared into the dying flames, his mind numb from the terror and exhaustion. The eclipse would soon pass, and with it, hopefully, the monsters would retreat. But for now, the only thing standing between them and certain death was a dwindling fire and a handful of burning embers. He just had to hold on a little longer. The light returned gradually, creeping across the village as the eclipse came to an end. First, there was a faint glimmer on the horizon. Then the jungle around them began to brighten, until finally, the sun burst free from behind the moon, bathing everything in harsh daylight. Daniel blinked against the sudden brightness, his entire body aching from the tension and fear. He looked around, disoriented, unsure if the danger had truly passed. For a long moment, he simply sat there by the dying fire, his breath ragged, unable to fully process what had happened. The creatures were gone. The strange shifting shadows that had hunted them in the darkness had vanished, slipping back into the jungle with the return of the sun. But the memory of their attacks remained, as vivid and terrifying as the bloodstains on the ground. Beside him, the tribe leader stirred, his face pale but his breathing steady. Daniel quickly checked the makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around the leader's side. It had done little to stop the bleeding, but it had kept the leader alive through the night. "They're gone," Daniel said quietly, as much to himself as to the leader. "We survived." The leader's eyes opened slightly, and he gave a faint nod. For now, Daniel helped the leader sit up, though every movement felt like a monumental effort. The village around them was eerily silent. Bodies lay strewn across the ground, both villagers and UN volunteers. The barricades were splintered, the huts damaged from the chaos of the attack. But it was over. The monsters had retreated with the darkness. "I need to check on the others," Daniel muttered, though he wasn't sure how many others were left. The leader gave a weak nod. "Go." Daniel rose on shaky legs and began walking through the village. His camera still hung around his neck, but it felt like a burden now, a reminder of how little he had been able to do as the chaos unfolded. He passed the broken barricades, stepping over spears and fallen debris, his mind reeling from the scale of the devastation. His camera was heavy in his hands, but for the first time, he hesitated to take a photo. This wasn't something the world needed to see. It was too unreal. The few villagers who had survived were tending to the wounded or mourning the dead. A handful of UN volunteers remained, their faces pale and stricken with horror. Jason was gone, dragged into the darkness like so many others. Daniel's stomach turned as he thought of how confident he had been when they arrived. How sure he was that nothing would happen. It felt like a distant memory now, buried under layers of fear and disbelief. As he walked toward the edge of the village, his eyes landed on his camera. He hadn't taken many photos since the eclipse began, too consumed by the terror to care about documentation. But he had captured plenty before. Maybe it had all been paranoia. Maybe it wasn't real. He had to know. He stopped, crouching in the shade of a nearby hut, and began flipping through the photos he had taken earlier. Before the eclipse, when everything still seemed normal. The shots of the villagers preparing the barricades, the children playing by the river, the leader listening to the radio, it all looked ordinary. Until it didn't. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. In one of the shots, taken near the edge of the jungle, something was off. At first glance, it seemed normal enough. A wide shot of the village's perimeter, the barricades just visible in the frame. But in the shadows of the trees, barely noticeable, there was something distorted. A shape, flickering in and out of focus. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The shadow had a form, something unnatural, creeping just out of sight. His hand shook as he flicked to the next photo. This one was even clearer. Another shot of the perimeter, but this time, the shadow was larger, its shape more defined. It was the same flickering, distorted movement he had seen during the attack. The creatures had been there, hiding in the shadows, long before the eclipse had started. Daniel's stomach twisted in knots. He flipped through more photos, each one revealing a glimpse of the creatures lurking just beyond the village. In some shots, their shapes were barely visible, blending seamlessly into the dark. In others, they stood out starkly against the sunlight, their forms twisted and unnatural. It was proof that the monsters were real. But as Daniel stared at the photos, his heart sank. This evidence, it wouldn't be enough. Even with the strange shapes caught on camera, no one would believe what had really happened here. They would call it a trick of the light, a photographic error, anything but the truth. Daniel let out a shaky breath, his mind reeling from the weight of it all. He had proof, but it would never explain the horrors they had faced. The blood, the screams, the shadows. None of it would ever be understood. Not by the outside world. He snapped the camera shut and slung it over his shoulder, rising to his feet. The survivors were beginning to gather, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. They had made it through the night, but the scars would remain. As Daniel helped the tribe leader to his feet, his eyes lingered on the jungle. The monsters had retreated, but he knew. Deep down, they weren't gone. They were just waiting for the darkness to return. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.